So, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker, Stephen Laster. A seasoned technologist, business leader, product strategist, digital learning designer, and educator. As Chief Digital Officer of McGraw-Hill Education, he is responsible for creating and compelling student experiences and developing breakthrough teaching and learning solutions. Stephen has served as the Chief Information and Technology Officer of the Harvard Business School, and as a member of the Harvard Business School Administrative Leadership Team, he led a team of over 130 professionals who oversaw the school's award-winning academic, research, and administrative computer environment. While at Harvard, he also taught courses at the undergraduate, graduate level, and executive professional level in technology leadership, problem solving, software design, and e-learning product development. Prior to joining Harvard, Mr. Laster held several leadership positions at Babson College, where, by the way, he also earned his MBA, including Chief Technology Officer for Babson's for-profit e-learning company and Director of Curriculum Innovation and Technology. He was responsible for Babson's adoption of blended learning and led the effort to increase working professional MBA enrollments by 500% through the creation of a state-of-the-art blended MBA program. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Stephen Laster to the stage.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I hope you guys had a really eventful morning, and I hope you're taking time at this conference to really let go of the day-to-day and really expand your thinking on technology and education. We certainly practice our craft in very interesting times. And I want to spend the next few minutes with you talking about how I see our craft changing, discussing how big data is changing, not will change, our craft, but most importantly, having a dialogue. And so we're going to leave time for questions and discussion. I know I'm competing with coffee and dessert, but we'll do our best to provoke some conversation out of you. And worst comes to worst, we can always become Socratic and just randomly call on people. How does that sound? Before we get started, just a little bit more about me, simply to help you understand the way I think, if that's okay. I've been fortunate to work in the industry at Babson and at HBS. At Babson, I was fortunate to teach undergraduate, graduate, and executives. During that same time period, I was also fortunate to start a consulting company called Intelligent Solutions, where I ended up over about an 8-year period getting onto about 40 campuses in a consulting role. And the consulting engagements were really one of two. One, we want to go online. How do we do it? And two, the more annoying one is, I have a CIO and I don't really understand what they do. Is the CIO any good? And I will add that I had 2 lifetimes as CIO of HBS because I was there 6 years, double the average length of tenure of a higher ed CIO, and I'm proud of that. I also learned a ton. I came to the industry out of a career of software in e-commerce prior to that, where we went from brick and mortar to web-driven, personalized, data-driven, scenario-driven e-commerce. And I was in e-commerce in the late 90s and the early 2000s when we really did reinvent how people shop and how websites behave. Been in the industry since then, and given the two, guess where I'd rather be? In education. What drives that is an innate desire to have the classroom and the experience be more impactful, because I personally benefited from the rise of technology in the classroom. I am massively dyslexic. If you looked at my work in middle school and in the early years, I couldn't read my own handwriting. I used to hide my books. They used to just disappear. But yet I could recite what was happening in class because I also have this awesome gift. And that's a near photographic oral memory. And to this day, I can still hear lectures in my head. I also have the other gifts that many dyslexics have, and that is I can model and think through ideas in rapid iteration. And the overdone strength of that is it's really easy for me to lose people. So if I lose you, please slow me down. But what I saw in those early days is a curriculum that doesn't work for people like me. I saw in those early days a curriculum where when you're asked to go stand on the board and write your fractions or do your long division or do your decimals, it's a near-death sentence. Why? Because you're sure to reverse your numbers. And why? Because you're sure to have a teacher like I did who said, Stephen, if you just roll down your sleeves, sat up straight, and were just a little bit neater, you too could be a good student. And the truth is, many of our curricula today still embody those beliefs. Maybe not explicitly, but certainly tacitly. We have students of all kinds of learning styles and all kinds of behaviors. Many are incredibly gifted, and many don't fit in the experience we are all delivering. And we'll talk about that for a minute. So for me, this journey, technology and education, is intensely personal. And it became even more personal when I found out both my kids are dyslexic and I had passed the gift down to them. I'm fortunate, though, because I live in Massachusetts, and we happen to have one of the best schools for dyslexics in the country. And what they're learning and what's written on the side of their school building is, it's cool to be dyslexic. We see the world differently. But to see the world differently, it's got to be a very customized world, and we'll talk about that in a minute. I want to just level set, and you've probably seen some of this, and some of this may feel like hype, and some of this you may not even care about, but I want you to. But before I go on, how many people work in the technology practice in their campus? Almost all of us. And how many people also are teaching part-time or full-time? About half of us. The single best gift I was given as a technology leader in higher education came on my third day at Babson, my third day in the industry. When the department chair for the problem solving, or for the IT department rather, came to me and he said, you know this thing called Java, right? And I said, well, you know, I was just at Art Technology Group and we helped to invent server-side Java, so yeah, I think I know it pretty well. I'm also fluent in it and I've written a lot of programs in it. He goes, perfect. The head of our problem-solving course just quit and it's all in Java, so you're on. I said, I'm on what? He said, you're teaching in 3 days. And that was my introduction to teaching. I was fortunate to have very good peers who helped me figure out what it means to teach undergrads. And the second semester, when I had the first line of the hockey team in my course, that became even more important because they weren't there necessarily to be engaged with Java. But by the end of the course, they were, which was fun and challenging. It's argued today that we're in the tail end of the higher ed bubble. And it's bursting right in front of you. Higher ed, whether we like to admit it or not, is comprised of several different markets. There's the NESCACs and the elites and the Ivies that some of us come from or have worked at. There's the privates, say top 100 to top 400. There's the open access and land grants, and they're the community college, and dare I say, the lower tier privates. But the truth is there are about 4,700 institutions just in the United States. And the truth is, for the first time ever, a good number of them cannot raise tuition. The market won't stand it. And the truth is, a good number of them, if you add back deferred maintenance, including those 15-year-old servers some of us are running, they're technically bankrupt. And so we're just starting to see on the edges consolidation. And expect it to accelerate. Expect it to accelerate as it did in airlines, in banking, in media, in healthcare, in real estate, in professional services. There are inherent inefficiencies in having 4,700 institutions today. And that's just the truth. We're seeing enrollment growth decline. We're seeing debt accelerate. Agreed? And then as we think about it and look at who's coming to higher ed, we're seeing more and more students in need of remediation. And so we could stop now and just blame the K-12 system, or we could embrace it and know that it's something that we have to deal with. And the K-12 system is equally challenged. Investments in K-12 have gone up exponentially. Outcomes have remained flat. That's a conversation for a different day. But what we do know is that we have a lot of students, 51%, entering two-year colleges that are in need of remediation, and 20% into 4 years. We also know that those students in need of remediation are not necessarily successful in getting the degree. And that's a problem. It's wasted potential and wasted resource of an increasingly more expensive solution. One of our data scientists at McGraw-Hill did this plot. I found it very enlightening. So the interesting thing is, for a 4-year institution, it's generally agreed upon that the average graduation period time is about 6 years. And that's accepted in most of the research today. What's the problem with that? It's supposed to be a 4-year degree. So number one is we've slipped from 4 to 6 years, but let's take that as somewhat acceptable. So this is starting to look at the graduation rates versus tuition. The size of the dot represents number of students. Green is for-profit. The orange is private, not-for-profit, and the blue is public. Look at the numbers close on the far right to the 100% graduation rate, and what do you see? Do you see a lot of students there? And look at far left. What do you see? Some big bubbles, maybe? The point is, we're offering an inferior product. Can I use the word? Education product. Should we have a discussion about student as customer? That's a different day. But the point is, we have a lot of people coming into the system, and we don't have enough people successfully leaving the system. And in the middle, they're spending money. And in the middle, they're attracted to the promise of a life full of contribution based on what we're offering. And the trend is going more towards the left than the right. And that, to me, is a problem. And at the same time, we understand the value of the degree. How many people have friends or former students, neighbors, who work in manufacturing? Anybody? There used to be a time that you could go to high school and get a really good manufacturing job, yes? Wasn't that long ago. It's impossible today. It's impossible today to get most good-paying jobs without having that 4-year degree. And what we see is that people with that degree can exponentially earn better over a lifetime than people without. So we know the degree is powerful. We know the degree is life-changing. And even if we believe in the value of a liberal education, as I do, and we don't see education as simply a means to a vocation, it's super important. Because what happens with a poorly educated populace? What happens to innovation? What happens to understanding? What happens to consensus, to compromise, to community, if that were to go by the wayside? Project that out, and it's not very pretty. Project that out in a world where population growth is putting pressure. Project that out into a world where we have some really big decisions to make over the next 30 years, I would argue, if we're going to continue on towards prosperity. So, lower completion rates, higher cost, near bankrupt institutions, high levels of fragmentation, high levels of debt. Did I just describe the housing market about 4 years ago? It's higher ed today. So we as practitioners of technology within the context of education cannot unilaterally drive this change, I would argue. And conversely, and optimistically, we actually can drive a lot of it, just not all of it. So let's talk about that for a few minutes. Does that make sense? Great. How many of you have big data initiatives on your campuses? A lot of you. How many of you had a dean or provost or president walk down, find you somewhere, maybe even in a basement suite? That's where my office was most of the time. and say, you know, this big data stuff, we really got to do something with it. Go figure it out. Anybody have that happen, more or less? Same thing with online, but that's, again, another different conversation. So here's my worry about big data. I don't know what to do with it in education. And I've been in quote-unquote big data literally since the late 90s, when I was privileged to work on scenario-driven commerce sites for people like American Airlines, Nike, Pet.com, Garden.com. I don't think they quite survived, but the work was fun. I do not for a minute believe that education is about massing terabytes of data and asking the data to tell me the patterns. By the way, I believe that's a very legitimate and necessary practice in a lot of instances. But I think education is different than that, and I do believe big data really is alluding to that very idea. Bring the data together, put some computer scientists and very smart people in front of it, and look for patterns and insights. And I love that idea, except when it comes to education. So a couple of things I believe first and foremost is that education needs to be a safe space to grow and explore and develop. Second thing I believe deeply is that education without measurement doesn't happen. If you're trying to learn and you can't have any sense of progress made, if you can't understand strengths and weaknesses, what happens in the life of the learner? What do y'all think? How many times have you started something and stuck with it with no feedback? Anybody seen that to completion? No hands are up. In fact, we need measurement to have feedback. We need measurement to drive engagement. And we need data as part of measurement, but I don't think it's starting from a blank slate and simply collecting, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Instead, what I'd much rather have us talk about and think about is a term one of my colleagues has begun to use, which resonated deeply with me. Brian Kibbe just had an article about it, which is this idea of small data. And by the way, any buzz term used enough becomes annoying, right? But the idea is that data can tell us a lot in context. And the idea is that you all are providing opportunities to build context. Done well. And the idea is that learning is, in many ways, a bounded journey. As we think about the course, as we think about the discipline, if we think about the domain, there are certain elements and behaviors and ideas and concepts and capabilities one has to master to be proficient. Yes? For example, if one were to be a very good software engineer, do we have any doubt that the person need to understand iteration, selection, recursion, separation of concerns, regardless of language, data types, so forth and so on? And in all of the disciplines and all of the subjects that we teach at all of our institutions, the truth is there is a known body of knowledge and a known set of capabilities that we're trying to impart. And isn't it our job as an institution, as an industry, to embrace a student in their area of discovery and impart to them enough of a capability so that they can take over responsibility for a life of learning within the areas they decide to explore? Isn't that our job? And that's very different than looking at a set of data, I think, and just figuring out if they like pants, here are the shoes that they like. Right? If they bought a house, maybe they need a refrigerator. Customers like this person also bought this other stuff. I find the two not analog. And I believe the two offer and deserve different consideration. And so I'd like to get us away from the word big data. What do you think? How's the coffee? You're still here. This is wonderful. Data alone isn't enough in the story I just told. You need supporting elements wrapped around the data, and we're going to talk about this in a bit more detail. But what I just discussed when we were talking about that burgeoning software engineer is the idea that the discipline lives within a map of knowledge, a map of understanding, a map of capabilities. The map isn't necessarily universally agreed upon, but elements of it are. But nonetheless, there is a map of knowledge that could be represented. It's multidimensional. Depending on the level of disaggregation, it can have many relationships or fewer. That's the artful side of this. But shouldn't the starting point be a map? And then perhaps the question is how to most efficiently move the learner through the map. Because if we can understand dynamic relationships of elements of the knowledge map, and let's agree they're dynamic. Let's agree that depending on the learner, but depending on their life experiences, their interactions, their innate capabilities, whether or not they're dyslexic, and so on, they may see relationships in the map differently, and isn't that a beautiful thing? Because it's those differences that drive innovation. It's those differences that move the discipline forward. It's those those differences that create new ideas. And then can we give them pedagogically useful insights? How many of you have office hours on your campus? Anybody? How many of your faculty are still required to hold them, be it online or in office? Most. Because most of your accreditors look for it. Imagine if that dialogue could be exponentially more powerful because that faculty member understands how the student perceives the map. What would the nature of that discourse be like? Imagine a student armed and well prepared for a conversation when they truly are lost to get them back on track. And the map and the data can help do that. So it is about structures, and then it is about mining the engagement and activity with the structures to understand where we might be going for the student, for the teacher, and for the class. So it's easy to stand up here and talk about this. It's a little abstract, yes? And it's easy to sit and think about what the heck is Stephen saying when I'm still worried about managing labs, my network, my LMS, bring your own device, just simply getting good reporting out for institutional research. Should I go on? One of the challenges is how do we move away from that thinking and get some space in our day for activities and thinking that are closer to the learning moment without creating the career-limiting move, which is pretending we're part of the academy when we're not. Right? And it's hard. I've been on campuses as a consultant where the administration of the academy were tight, where IT was a central part of the conversation, out of the basement. And I've been on campuses when IT really is just a service organization, and damn it, can you help me change my password? Right? We can talk about that in a minute. But I want to offer up a couple of case studies to prove that what I'm talking about isn't the future. Because one thing I absolutely detest is a futurist. I remember going to EDUCAUSE, going to Campus Technology, going to Sloan's conferences as a burgeoning IT leader at Babson. And I would hear the keynote, and the keynote would be this future and say, in 5 years, this is what's going to happen. So I started writing it down. And then fortunately, I got the same futurist 5 years later. And what they said 5 years ago didn't happen. And I was the obnoxious person in the audience who went to the microphone. I said, 5 years ago you said this, and none of it happened. Why should we believe you today? I was younger then. I'm a little nicer now. But I have the same contempt for talking about 5 years from now, because all I know, having been in technology for about 30 years, is I have no idea what's happening 5 years from now, and neither do you. And that's okay. Because any strategy that's brittle and fixed for that period of time will simply lead to a waste of resources, and we all know that. I believe in an ever-changing, agile world. So as we talk about small data, I want to talk about places, 2 examples. Apologies in advance, these are McGraw-Hill products because I know them best. It's not a pitch. There are many great products out there. But if we go look at University of Texas in El Paso, they did just what I was talking about. They adopted a math product called ALEX. And ALEX takes this idea of knowledge map and has an AI engine and really looks at small amounts of student interaction with the platform, with the content, looks at their outcomes at a micro-learning objective level. And because of that, ALEX can make very good suggestions to the student about where they can go next in math and succeed. How many of you took a statistics course? How many of you loved it? My kind of people. I did too. We're weird, by the way. The truth is that part of the issue with math in the United States is frustration. And part of that frustration, I would argue, comes from probably student-faculty ratio. And part of that frustration comes from student getting lost and no one there to help. And unless you guys have this rapid endowment growth that I don't know about, we're not changing the student-faculty ratio anytime soon, correct? Heck, if we could, we should, by the way. And in K-12, if we could pay teachers more, we should probably do that too. But short of that, in a very natural way, students can engage with ALEX, and they can be given suggestions that are safe and that drive engagement. And the issue that was happening at University of Texas El Paso was the very fact that in 2007 they had students entering not prepared, and those students were not finishing the degree. And nothing is more tragic. Waste of human potential. And what they realized is that the place where they were least prepared was in math. And the other thing that was happening by 2010 is they were opening up access. They were loosening their requirements for entry. So you already had some students that were not well prepared, and you had a student body growing that was going to be even less well prepared. It's a pretty good challenge, yes? And arguably, it's a population where it's almost a crime to waste their tuition dollar, because a lot of it's coming via debt financing. And I think nothing is worse than offering somebody something that's going to change their life, asking them to go into debt for it, and them not getting the benefit and still having to pay for it. I just think that's not good, to put it lightly. And so what they introduced was this summer bridge course to bring students up to speed. And a big part of it was the student's ability to safely use ALEX, and ALEX's ability to tell student and teacher when necessary where the student's room for opportunity was in a non-penalizing way, and turn it kind of into a game of learning. And what they saw from that is students saving money. Cost saving spiked up. Then as access opened up, cost saving went down because more challenged students. And they saw much better graduation or completion rates. And they took it in the right direction without adding extraordinary cost to the program. So that's a case of small data enabling outcomes. It wasn't brought into this huge monolithic data mart. It wasn't trying to look at attributes outside the course of learning. It wasn't trying to create a massive campus initiative of millions of dollars. It was simply delivering education in a way that took advantage of organization, maps, and data. Second case study at Valencia. This was an accounting course. How many people took accounting and loved it? 6 semesters. So either going to go work at one of the then big 8, now what, big 4 or 2, or go into technology. Guess what? I made the right decision. I made that decision when the accounting firm recruiter said, Stephen, you're really bright. If you join us, we can tell you every year for the next 10 years what you're going to do. I saw the walls closing in, and so I ran and had a tech career. Much better. But I love accounting. Not everybody does. I'm not sure why. But that's okay. We're all different. But what we saw in this particular case study is a real need to flip the classroom. A real need to bring accounting to life. Because the truth is, if you're going to convene people, you shouldn't do it the way we're doing it right now. You could have watched me on YouTube. And if we're really going to convene people, it's in the workshops that you're in today. It's in the discussions that the Leadership Summit is having. It's about engagement, especially with today's student. And engagement happens in flipped classrooms beautifully. And if you think about the working student, the non-traditional student, you absolutely have to have engagement if you're going to force them onto campus. And we learned that in Babson's Fast Track MBA. When we launched that many years ago, it's about 50% of our new students were within 20 miles of the campus. Why? Because it was blended and flipped. Simple as that. So in this, the goal was to flip the classroom. The concern was, though, how are you actually going to get them through the content, yes? Because what we know is if you just say, hey, we're going to flip the classroom, make sure you read the book on your own time, what happens? How many of you have read a textbook in the last 3 years? About 5% of you. How many of you wish there were a different way, those of you who read? Good number of that. So what we did in this case is really gave them, again, an AI-driven solution that looks at a knowledge map, but also looks at their memory decay. It asks them their confidence in their answers. It asks them to tell us, when are you guessing? In a way not only that doesn't penalize, but in a way that also brings in a little bit of gamification, because it has an anonymous community of participants, and you can see how you're doing versus your community of peers without naming names. But what happens when we add competition? Come on, what happens? More engagement. We need more caffeine in the coffee, who's ever pouring. So it's about driving engagement, but again, it's about small data. It's about instrumented learning content. Learning content that's reporting out when it's being worked over. Learning content that says when I move through different elements and when I skip. Learning content that can say, here's Stephen's confidence level in understanding the difference between profit and revenue. What's the difference? Under which case, if you maximize which, can you potentially go out of business? Profit or revenue? Revenue. Guys, come on. If you maximize revenue, you have no assurance of staying in business. Why? You don't know about costs. Guess where I learned that? From our stuff. No, just kidding. But I could. And by the way, for most freshmen in accounting, that very concept is really difficult to grasp. And by the way, for many adults, it appears it might be too. The idea here, though, is the data collected was purposeful. It was to a learning means. And by the way, the techniques have been generalized to over 900 different course discipline combinations. Purposeful. And by the way, the results are demonstrable. And what this doesn't show is student satisfaction, which also went up significantly. Because they're getting feedback. Because they're saving time. Because they're not feeling lost. Because they're not feeling intimidated. Have you ever looked at a 600-page accounting text and felt good about it? If you have, we should talk after this discussion. So it's nice that it's about small data and context. It's nice that I can show you some examples of those who are doing it. But what's more important is how do you get there from here? To quote some famous Maine storytellers. Anybody from Maine? Bert and I? No? Yes? Good. I spent 6 years in Maine. It's a beautiful state. Because I want you to get here. I want you to get there. I want you to care less about infrastructure and BYOD and Google Apps and O365 and your next LMS. You got to do all that extremely well, by the way, or you have no room in the conversation. But I believe we've arrived at a moment in time where doing that well takes far less concentration and resources than it did 10 years ago. So just let's get that done. It's solvable. The real question is, how do you enter into the learning conversation on your campus? Helpfully. Not as a know-it-all. No career-limiting moves, no Stephen Saids, right? It's hard enough what we do every day. And so the real question is, how can you make that impact? So a couple of things. Number one is moving to small data, deeply woven with pedagogy, learning, and implemented well, is not going to change, not going to be the sole driver of change. It's one of a small piece. But as I'm frequently reminded by a good friend of mine, David Levin, first and foremost, it's about community and your own actions in the community. Are you approachable? Are you truly collaborative? Are you trustworthy? And by the way, one definition of collaboration that I love is, are you willing to suggest changes that outwardly could look like a net give up to you personally? Are you willing to make a personal sacrifice in service of the institution of the change? Could be people, could be budget, could be this fictitious concept somebody else told me about, control. Still don't know what that means. But number one, you need to be a collaborator and a trusted one. Number two is everything I've talked about is in service of master teachers and not so master teachers. But it's in service of the teacher-student relationship. Because at least for the period I can look at, which isn't 5 years, maybe it's 3, learning is social. And the teacher-student relationship is still paramount to my estimation. Especially as we look at our freshman and sophomore. Maybe there's more self-directed learning at the master's level. Even then, it's still pretty social. Now, the issue is we don't have enough master teachers available to us. So how do we help aspiring master teachers? And this can help. And it's about embracing standards. And I'm passionate about this, and I hope you are. As an expression of it, my influence to our products and my influence of my own time is about IMS's standards. Why? Because I like the way they're designed and implemented. Why? Because without standards to fall back on, we have chaos. Does anybody remember CC Mail? Does anybody remember when it was a miracle when 2 different organizations could exchange email with each other because you paid a third-party gateway provider to talk across email systems in about 92, as recently as then? Would you ever think about that today? Would you ever imagine you couldn't send somebody an email? Would you ever imagine you couldn't send somebody an enrollment to their SIS, regardless of institution? Oh, wait, we can't do that today. Why is that? Why is that okay? Why is it some of our most premier universities still have multiple SISs? Why is it okay that we can lock beautiful pedagogical designs within the boundary of a single instance of an LMS? Is that doing help or harm? Is that truly collaborative or not? You all can drive that. We have to drive that. And of course, we need feedback loops. Because the whole measurement thing. How are we doing with learning outcomes? With controlling cost? With enabling knowledge transfer? So for me, it is about a learning ecosystem. It's open and API driven, and it is built for change. When did the notion of an LMS really emerge? What year? 98? Any other years? Right, so in 98, you had Course Compass growing. You had Lotus Learning Space. You had sort of version 2 of WebCT, among others. And there was this need that we needed this web portal thingy to be a learning environment. And in those days, it made a whole lot of sense for one provider to deliver it all. It was new. It was complicated. If you were inventing the LMS today, would you ever build a monolithic solution? Anybody? Yet many of us are clinging on to the notion by our very action. By taking what are some very open LMSs and locking down their interoperability. By taking older versions of those LMSs and holding tightly onto them. By not pushing this idea of standards and pushing administration closer to the delivery of the course. But the truth is, we have standards and interoperability today in many fronts that allow for a learning ecosystem. But more often than not, we're getting in the way in the name of stability, uptime, security, privacy. It's a false analog. You can do it all today. You can have privacy, and we should. You can have uptime, and you should. And you can be open. And we have to be, if we're going to empower learning. Because it is about sharing. And by the way, even if you don't believe me, which is fine, as higher ed consolidates, you're going to be asked to do this anyway. So you might as well get ahead of the curve and be a hero versus a laggard. To me, the learning ecosystem, I apologize, this might be hard to read, so I'll talk to it for a minute, is not about the far right, which is just the LMS delivery mechanism. But it's understanding that delivery plus content plus metadata plus knowledge map have to be interwoven to get meaningful insights. How many of you spend a lot of time or are part of your library? Raise your hands. About 20%. Guess what the new and not so emerging role where the library gives us tremendous value is? It's about in creating our campus taxonomy for our digital learning objects. And without that campus taxonomy and without those learning objects properly tagged, they're not findable. They're not reusable. And they certainly aren't reportable. Would you ever, for those of you who develop software, keep all of your software on all of your engineers' hard drives? With no version control? With no search? How many would do that? And for how long would you be willing to do that? And in fact, that's what we're doing with our learning objects today. And that's not helpful. And there are ways to make that easier to solve. It's about wrapping those learning objects in runtimes that can benefit from shared identity. And many of us have solved that, but we haven't extended that to our learning content. Yeah, we've got it to the SIS and the financial aid system and the mail system. But we're not doing it down to learning objects runtimes such that we can report out interactions, such that we can report back to providers of visualizations who provide adaptive experiences. We haven't even thought about what I just said, and it sounded a little daunting, but it's not, because there's standards that allow us to do it, like learning tool interoperability, which, by the way, is pretty well exercised. It's about understanding that our faculty are creating content. We're going to get some from open source providers, some from library subscriptions, some from commercial providers. Some will come wrapped in their own metadata that we can borrow and make use of. And much of it, thanks to the needs and goals of our institutional research colleagues, are going to have to be wrapped in our metadata. So we can demonstrate outcomes to accreditors, to student, to department chair, to faculty, to alumni, to future employers. Make sense? And so one question is, who in your organization is getting this done? It's not an engineering problem, by the way. It's much more of a configuration problem. It's much more of an awareness problem. Because many of your partners in your learning ecosystem today already do this for you. You just don't use it. Because we're still counting how many LMS courses do we have, and we write a script to see how many syllabi are listed, and we think we've got the count. That was so 90s. The benefits are enormous. As we democratize access to the learning ecosystem, it allows faculty to experiment. It allows them to try out solutions in safe pilots to see if this is really pushing teaching and learning forward. And as we rationalize how we integrate, it allows us to collect that data in service of faculty and student easily without a new IT project. How many of you currently have more than 200 active projects this semester? Raise your hands. Not bad. That's about my average when I was a CIO. It was daunting. It allows data to flow without commercial boundaries. I am a firm believer, and if you believe me, would encourage your voice in that the data belongs to the learner. That nobody should have a business model of holding data hostage. That folks should get paid for the educational value they create. But let's keep the data where it belongs. And let's use it in the pursuit of teaching and learning, because there's so much positive impact we can create there. And of almost equal importance, and shouldn't go without saying, is it's about the user experience. What happens when our teachers, our faculty, our students get confused in your learning ecosystem? What happens to completion? It goes way down. What if it's an online course and they're confused? Goodbye. So one of the things we have to be dogmatic about is helping to create easy to understand user experiences. Doesn't mean we're going to start paying CSS designers to reskin everything. You don't need to. But you need to shut off competing features. You need to configure, not code. You need to actually talk about user experience to your more progressive faculty who are going to do their own assembly and help them understand the issues and the opportunities. And you have to bring it into the forefront so that the technology seamlessly goes into the background. We see learning happening, we see stick-to-itiveness, we see better outcomes when it's personalized, when it's driven by small data so it can adapt, and when the user experience just feels good. And that's all within our ability to influence. Notice I didn't say control. Influence. And so as I wrap with this part, and you all lead the next 10 or so, 15 minutes of conversation, burden's on you now. Assuming we don't want to be plumbers, and we don't. I don't think anybody in this room got into our art to do that. And assuming we want to make a significant impact on our campuses, and I believe we do, and in our practice in a macro sense, because we are in this very unique moment in time, just like web retail was about 10 or 12 years ago. And we are in the middle of consolidation, and in the best sense of Clay Christensen's research, in this beautiful moment of disruption. So it's not if, it's when. And assuming that small data and maybe big data play a large part of it, and I hope the two examples I showed you at least pique your interest, what are you prepared to do when you leave here? And how can I help you? And how can your colleagues help you for the rest of the afternoon? So what observations and questions might you have? There's a microphone. I think we're going to have a gentleman passing the microphone. What do you think? Questions? Done? All set?
I'm wondering about the reliability of the two examples that you shared in terms of, with the second one, in effect, what you're doing is you're giving students additional homework. And the data said 50% of them were doing 75% of it, which tells me 50% of them weren't doing 75% of it. I wonder, what fraction of the ones who were doing it were the ones who were going to get the higher grades anyway, which is, in fact, almost every faculty member's experience. And how much of the improvement was a function of just doing additional work as opposed to the specific product set. And on the first set from Texas El Paso, the numbers were all over the place from 2008 on. And so they went up, they plummeted down, they went up. And so, with a scatter like that, I don't know that I have any confidence of what the next year's data was going to show.
So let me try and answer them all, and if I miss something, please ask again. So what we see in the first one is that the engagement created, and we have many more data sets that I'd be happy to share with you. I can give you a card. What we saw with the accounting example is that because it was adaptive and personalized, you're right, time engaged goes up. And that's, in fact, one of our goals. So the assigned amount of homework hasn't changed, but the amount of time of engagement goes up. And the reason it goes up is because the student is less frustrated, or said more positively, more engaged with what they're working on. So in some of our disciplines, there's no shortcut. You need time for context, for practice. You need time to think about it, and you need time to reinforce it. And what we see in anybody's adaptive solution done well is that what we're trying to do is drive that level of engagement. And second point is we're trying to keep the student away from those areas that they've already mastered as a way of best optimizing their time. And we can be happy to share other studies with you that show that. On the El Paso example, the reason it went down is because the requirements to enter also went down. And we saw a correlation with that. And so what I didn't show is the full data set and also other comparators that would make the argument that, in fact, the improvement was demonstrable, and that that dip was directly related to a relaxing of an intake requirement that then had a population that was farther away from preparedness than in the other years. And so it saw the dip, and then you saw it coming back up. I don't know if that answers. Other questions?
Thank you for your talk. Awesome. I like to see the word small data, since big data is helpful too, but ultimately we're here for student success and measuring outcomes and things like that in the day-to-day classroom, which kind of leads me to my question. So as activities are encouraged face-to-face, as face-to-face is still a very valuable medium versus online versus blended, how do we capture, are we at a point where the face-to-face classroom is there's an assumption that you will use technology, because it seems like there's a disconnect between the face-to-face interaction of what's happening and the electronic metadata we can achieve. How do you bridge the gap between the face-to-face and the online?
Sure, and I would argue that, I would just say that I have a real bias towards blended if I were to pick my favorite modality based on what I know and based on the work that I've done. But I think the question is, to paraphrase, is along the lines of how do you instrument the face-to-face classroom? And I think my answer is I'm not sure you always need to do that. I think there are times when just the dynamic nature of the classroom is a beautiful thing. I think you run the risk of a disingenuous solution if you let instrumentation drive all action. But I think what you do is you instrument in ways that give you learning outcome data and insights that help student and teacher. And so to answer that question, I think it depends. It depends on what you're doing in that classroom. But certainly the immediacy of the technology that's available today can allow you to instrument it if it's useful to outcomes. And certainly there are times when it's not, and you shouldn't. And the best way for me to answer that, or any question about when do you use technology, is through the lens of the pedagogy. And then even deeper, through the lens more generalized of what are the characteristics of that student population this course on this campus on this semester are really targeted towards. And then last question is, what are the capabilities and comfort levels of that teacher, that professor? And I would encourage us always to think about all of those questions when solutioning.
As a follow-up maybe to that, all right, and I have to give the caveat that I'm naive and I'm learning all this as an entry-level person here to this data. But a follow-up to that, I'm interested in all those hidden collections of knowledge that, as far as I know, are not being mined at the moment. If anybody knows that what I'm about to ask is being mined, I'd be happy to hear about that. In the realm, you were talking about the learning management systems, in the realm of all these lecture captures that campuses do on our campus, other than the people using that, the professors using that lecture capture, I don't know of any system that's up where you could sort of mine how a campus or how a region or how a university actually teaches classes, both what is said and heard and what is shown in those classes, and some way to compile all that collection of lecture captures to get some data that would be useful for the greater good. Is anything like that afoot, or is that of interest to people?
That's a question to the group. Are there any comments to that question? I think what you're asking about is, can we do semantic analysis over the lecture itself and then correlate that into students' perception, engagements, and outcomes?
And is it legal to share that information that's happened in a broad and open way?
Yeah, so broad and open, and I'm not a lawyer, I don't play one. But what I would say is that anything we do needs to fit comfortably with inside of FERPA, right? And because that's the environment in which we operate. And certainly using data in pursuit of learning outcomes in the course of delivery of instruction in the intimacy of the student-faculty relationship, not only is a question of legal or not, it's an ethical thing to do. And we've been doing it for years. It's called an exam. Right? You know, are there commercial implementations of doing deep semantic analysis over video lectures and then correlating them to student comments, outcomes, and behaviors? Personally, I don't know one that's been commercialized yet, but do others?
I know of one. The company that's recording you right now has that available.
So there you go. So you guys should chat. Time for one more question. Please.
What is the makeup at McGraw-Hill that is, of the big three, McGraw-Hill tends to be the most willing to be a little more innovative in the use of digital technology and less wanting to control the content, yep. Making it available to the user in many more ways. What's different in your makeup than the other boys?
They hired me. So I was brought in 18 months ago really and I'd never worked at a publisher and have no aspiration to, so all sarcasm aside, my job at McGraw-Hill is to help us teach in today's world and tomorrow's world. And mostly I care about today and the next couple of years, and the rest will take care of itself. So I have the honor of really having a 1,000-person team worldwide to drive that goal. As a senior leadership team in McGraw-Hill, we do believe that we have a lot of value, but it's in an open world. And that's just our beliefs versus others. And I don't know who's right and who's wrong. Y'all will decide. But what I believe is that if we're making tools, techniques, and pedagogical opportunities that help you on your campus and help teachers, then we'll do fine as a company. And I believe that if we try and be a walled garden on one end, or if we get too cute on the other, you'll tell us immediately, as you should. You know, I used to say, I was sitting at one of the greatest jobs in the world, I believe. I was CIO of the Harvard Business School, a place I thought I would never leave. And the CEO of McGraw-Hill asked me to come. And I said I would only come under those conditions. He goes, I know, that's why I want you to come. And for us, it's about really impacting the heart of education, both higher ed and K-12. We know, right or wrong, that the students in the elite, well-funded institutions are in very good hands. And we know the students that don't have those same kind of endowments to benefit from deserve an equal opportunity for education and for transformation. And so we're trying to service everybody, but if we had to ever err at the margins, it's about helping the heart of the higher ed system. And why do we believe that? It's really the culture of our leadership team. It's a bet we're placing, and we hope it's the right one. Thank you guys for listening to me. I hope it was useful, and I hope it provoked some ideas. Enjoy the rest of your day.